website for our calendar, and then you can register for any of this talk, and you get an invitation to join us next for the next talks. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Kevin Zollman from Carnegie Mellon University. Kevin is, of course, a good friend of the center, and we're very happy to see him either in person or today on Zoom with us. And Kevin is a professor of philosophy in the Department of Philosophy at CMU. He also has an appointment in the Social and Decision Sciences, not department, I suppose, unit or whatever the right term is. He specializes in game theory, philosophy of science, philosophy of biology, philosophy of economics. In philosophy of science, he's published extensively on social epistemology of science using formal models and simulation. I think I can mention the books, the very interesting books that he published a few years ago, The Game Theorist's Guide to Parenting. If you've got a child and you need to deal with that child, I highly recommend that book's been very helpful for me. And according to his CV, but I didn't have time to confirm, he's working on a new book, Network Epistemology, How Our Social Connections Shape Knowledge with OUP. Kevin has published widely on all of these topics in the best journals in philosophy of science and in philosophy, including with one of our visiting fellows this semester, Hannah Rubin, who is a forthcoming paper in the American Philosophical Quarterly. And I think without further ado, I could spend a really long time going through the CV because it's a quite long CV. But without further ado, I'd rather hear Kevin talk to us about conformity, social network, and the emergence of pluralistic ignorance. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Edward, for that very kind introduction. And Edward was right. I am working on a book on social epistemology and networks right now. And actually, this is a chapter of that book. So comments are, of course, always welcome, but especially welcome at the moment because this is a chapter of ongoing work. So the topic that I'm interested in is this topic which has occupied both philosophers of science, or philosophers in general, social epistemologists, as well as philosophers of science, but also social psychologists quite a bit, which is this idea called pluralistic ignorance. And my apologies for those of you who maybe already know what this is, but let me just take a moment to introduce it. It's oftentimes illustrated with a relatively common example. And there's actually been quite a bit of research looking at this particular example. The idea here is you might have a group of people who go out for drinks. One of them may think, oh, you know, I'm really tired of drinking. I've had a little bit too much. I really feel like it's time to take it easy. But everybody else seems to be enjoying their time drinking. And so I hate to stop the fun. And so I'll just go along with everyone else. This is a very common experience. And so far, this is not yet pluralistic ignorance. But pluralistic ignorance emerges in a situation where it's not just one person who thinks this, but rather everyone is thinking this. And so everyone is saying, oh, I don't really want another drink, but everybody else seems to be enjoying themselves. And so I'll just go along with the group. And this is the pluralistic ignorance part. This is the ignorance part. That is, the idea here is that everybody privately would like to say stop drinking or go home or call it a night or whatever, but no one expresses that because they think they're alone or unique or rare in this respect. And so then they appear to everyone else as if they are enjoying drinking. And so then this ignorance is perpetuated by the fact that no one is sort of speaking up and announcing their private beliefs. Now, pluralistic ignorance has been posited to be at the base of a lot of social phenomena. And I'd like to introduce a distinction between two different types of pluralistic ignorance. I don't mean this in the type sense of being like everything is going to neatly fit into one category or the other. In fact, most cases of pluralistic ignorance sort of have aspects of both. But there are some that are sort of more of one type or less of one type. And so that's why I kind of want to add this distinction. The first is what I'm calling preference-based pluralistic ignorance, which the drinking example is a good example of. The thing that is the underlying state that we're ignorant about is one about preferences. I would rather drink less, and so would everyone else, and that's the thing that we're ignorant about, that everyone else would like to drink less. There are lots of other examples of this. Christina Bichieri has talked quite a bit about the role of pluralistic ignorance in sanitation habits in developing countries, in particular the end of open defecation. Child rearing practices is another place. Christina, but lots of others have talked about the role of pluralistic ignorance in perpetuating various forms of child abuse, or also a number of other child rearing practices. The earliest work on pluralistic ignorance was about the perpetuation of discrimination. That was, there appeared to be pluralistic ignorance in the American South about segregation. That is, most people thought that it would be better to end segregation, but they thought they were in the minority. And also there's been a lot of research about sexual promiscuity, especially in young teenagers. Again, similar thing. I don't want to be as promiscuous, but as I am being, but I feel as though I need to because I feel like everyone else expects me to be, something like that. All of these, the common thread is the thing that's underlying is sort of a subjective thing, a statement of individual preference about which there can be pluralistic ignorance. I want to contrast that with what I'm calling epistemic pluralistic ignorance, where the thing that there's the pluralistic ignorance about is something more objective. It's a fact in the world, and then the thing that we're pluralistically ignorant about is people's belief in that. So, for instance, there are some studies that suggest that climate change in denialist communities may have this feature. That is, that people believe that that human-caused climate change is real, but they think they're in the minority about this, and so they keep quiet. They don't admit to having that belief. They avoid the topic. And so as a result, the idea, many people in fact believe in it, but they all believe that they're in the minority. There's been work in business about response to poor performance of corporations and reactions of managers to that suggests that pluralistic ignorance may be going on there, which is that the pluralistic ignorance may be that each individual acknowledges that the company is performing poorly privately, but they don't want to acknowledge it publicly because they think that they're the only one that thinks that the company is performing poorly. Christina Bichieri has also talked a little bit about breastfeeding and the health of breastfeeding. So there are communities where they think breastfeeding is bad for an infant. The idea is that maybe privately each individual thinks that it's good, but they don't want to admit it because they think no one else agrees with them. And then imposter syndrome is another example that's been used like this. That is, I think that the material is very hard, but I don't want to say that the material is very hard because I think I'm the only one that's facing difficulties, something like that. So there's lots of, I'm not necessarily saying that all of these are examples of pluralistic ignorance, but rather I just want to say this is the kind of phenomena that people tend to look for in a lot of cases, and they tend to find in a lot of cases. And in particular, for the purposes of this talk, I want to focus mostly on the epistemic side. Not that the preference side isn't interesting. In fact, I think it's very interesting, but I think that the epistemic side has received relatively less attention and has some interesting dynamic features of its own. So for the purposes of this talk, we're going to be looking at the epistemic pluralistic ignorance with the idea that many of the things that I say may be relevant to the preference-based as well, but the focus is going to be on epistemic. The first thing that I think it's worth just taking a moment to mention is that I think as a result of largely the bias in the way the research is conducted, people tend to look for pluralistic ignorance in what we might think of as socially bad settings. That is, we go out looking for pluralistic ignorance, in cases where we want to change social norms, like away from open defecation or toward breastfeeding or other things like this. But in fact, it may well be the case that pluralistic ignorance is also involved in things that we regard as socially good. So for instance, participation in public goods, there's no study of this. This is a conjecture on my part, but participation in public goods may well be an example of pluralistic ignorance. It may be that everybody would like to privately shirk, but they think that they are the only ones who want to privately shirk, and so they don't do it because they're worried about it. Similarly, some movements for political correctness are actually sometimes explicitly attempting to generate pluralistic ignorance. The idea is that it may be that most people are racist, but if you can get people to shut up about it, then they will think that other people aren't racist, and maybe we can eventually eliminate racism. So it may be that talking about the pluralistic ignorance, although the literature tends to have this negative valence to it, it's not obvious to me that pluralistic ignorance is uniformly socially bad. Although we can think of it as an epistemic pathology, if not a practical one, because the idea is there are false beliefs involved. Now, maybe those false beliefs are good in a certain sense, but there are false beliefs. I also want to take a moment because pluralistic ignorance often gets lumped in or confused with a collection of other phenomena that are also relatively well studied. But I think that it's important to be very clear that pluralistic ignorance is actually a very special kind of phenomenon. The first one that it sometimes gets confused for is something that in the economics literature gets called social learning or information cascades. The idea about social learning and information cascades is this idea that I can learn from your beliefs. So for instance, I don't know very much about psychology or cognitive science. I can ask, some of my colleagues that are here, like Edouard or Colin or David, and say, hey, I have this thing, that I don't know about psychology. Tell me what you think. And they can tell me what they think. And I change my beliefs as a result of that. Right? That's social learning. So I didn't learn it directly. I learned it via someone else. But nonetheless, I changed my beliefs. This is not pluralistic ignorance, because although it's the case that my beliefs have changed as a result of somebody else, there's nothing to be ignorant about. My beliefs have in fact changed. In pluralistic ignorance, the important thing is that my belief hasn't changed. I still believe in climate change, but I shut up about it because I think I'm in the minority. So it's important to distinguish between these two, because in one case, I change my belief, and in the other case, I keep a belief, but nonetheless, my behavior is the same in both cases. The other thing is that pluralistic ignorance requires this notion of ignorance. If you truly are in the minority, that is, if I believe in climate change, but I'm in a community where most people do not believe in climate change, I might choose to conform, but this isn't a case of pluralistic ignorance. Pluralistic ignorance requires that most people share the belief, but that most people don't express it. And this is one thing that's particularly difficult to distinguish between. Are we in a case where the people are correct that they're in the minority, or are we in a case where there's pluralistic ignorance? The last example, there's not a good name for this, so I've stolen a name from statistics, asymmetric loss. It's not a great name, but there are some circumstances where it's not that I think that I'm in the minority. I just don't tell you what my belief is because I see no particular value to it. So, if I think that my friend's husband is obnoxious, I may just keep that to myself, not because of any kind of pluralistic ignorance or conformity effects, but just because what do I stand to gain from saying so publicly? It's rude, it potentially hurts a friendship, and so I just keep quiet. And this is not a case of pluralistic ignorance, even if a lot of people are doing it. Because, for instance, it may be that all of us know that we all think that the husband is obnoxious, but none of us say it because we don't have anything to gain from saying it. Again, that's not pluralistic ignorance, because pluralistic ignorance requires that I believe that I'm in the minority incorrectly. Okay, so I just wanted to lay those different distinctions on the table because I actually think it's important to illustrate how relatively special and unique pluralistic ignorance is. It requires this very special set of circumstances. You have a belief, most people have that belief, but you incorrectly think that you're in the minority and so keep quiet as a result. Right? And so this is the kind of central feature of pluralistic ignorance. Most people believe something, most people who believe it say they don't or keep quiet or something like that. And they do that because they think one is false, because of this false belief. So, most of the research on pluralistic ignorance has taken place in sociology, social psychology, where the real interest has been in identifying cases of pluralistic ignorance. And I want to ask a kind of dynamic question about pluralistic ignorance. That is, where does it come from and why does it persist? And so they're kind of, thinking of this from a social dynamics perspective, there are really kind of two basic questions that one wants to ask about any oddball social phenomenon. The first question is a stability question. Why, in cases of pluralistic ignorance, does it persist? If we find ourselves in a case of pluralistic ignorance, why doesn't it go away? The second question is a case of emergence. How do we come to be in a situation of pluralistic ignorance, right? That is, how did we end up in this odd situation where everybody incorrectly has this belief about everyone else? So I think that they're in order of difficulty on the screen. The stability question is actually somewhat easy to answer. The emergence question is more difficult. So let me just give you the quick version of the stability question. And in order to do so, I want to introduce or actually steal a very simple model of the strategic situation here that individuals face. So we're going to model individuals in a super simple way. There's a proposition under discussion, something like climate change or the health of breastfeeding or something like this. And the individual is modeled as assigning a probability to the truth of that proposition, right? So they're just a single probability. There's nothing rich and complicated here. It's just a single number that represents their strength of belief. And if you don't like probabilities, just any measure of strength of belief. That's private. That's the thing that's in their head. That's the thing that represents what their private judgment is. But then they're forced to make a public declaration, and that public declaration is of a qualitative sort. They either declare that they believe it or that they disbelieve it, or they engage in a behavior that is consistent with the belief or not consistent with the belief, or they speak up or stay silent, to some binary choice where that choice represents either a belief or a disbelief in the proposition. Now, how do we go from their private belief to their public statement? Well, the idea is that each individual it feels drawn in two potentially different directions. On the one hand, they like to say things that they believe. That's a kind of a truth sensitivity that we might imagine. On the other hand, they also feel a desire to conform. That is, they want to say the thing that everyone else is saying. And those two things, it may pull in the same direction or may pull in opposite directions. And we're going to represent their decision with a very simple utility function. This is a model of individual behavior that I'm borrowing from this paper by Moseni and Williams. They use this for a different purpose. So I'm not just repeating what they're doing, but I'm using their utility function in order to do something slightly different. So in their utility function, it's very simple. This is just making quantitative what I just said. So there's nothing new here that I didn't already say. There's this parameter alpha, which represents the truth sensitivity. So if alpha is equal to 1, then I just say what I believe, and that's the end of it. If alpha is equal to 0, I just say what everyone else says, and I don't care about whether it's true. And if alpha lives somewhere in between 1 and 0, that represents the balance that I have between how much do I desire to conform and how much do I desire to say what I believe. If we model individuals as this, using this utility function, we can answer that stability question right away, right? So we can say, look, if everyone else says they like drinking, or if everyone else says that they believe in, or that they don't believe in climate change or whatever, so long as my truth sensitivity is sufficiently low, that is, so long as my desire to conform is sufficiently high, then I'll go along with the group. And if everyone will do that. So it represents an equilibrium of what game theorists call a coordination game. It's an inferior equilibrium. That is, if we knew we were in this setting, we would say, hey, folks, we're in a bad equilibrium. Let's all switch and let's all just say what we actually believe because we would be better off. But if we don't know that that's the situation, then we're stuck there. So as a result, we can explain pluralistic ignorance using a relatively simple game theoretic concept. That is an equilibrium concept, assuming that people have these two different desires, the desire to tell the truth and the desire to conform. And so long as the desire to conform is sufficiently high, once we're in a setting of pluralistic ignorance, we would expect the society to stay there until something jostles them out of it. Okay, so that answers the stability question. Now the emergence question. How do we get ourselves to that equilibrium? How do we find ourselves in a setting where we are in pluralistic ignorance? And there have been two conjectures in the literature about how pluralistic ignorance might arise. Some formal modeling literature, some just conjectures, some empirical research, but I don't think that there's anything really definitive in my mind. The first conjecture is a kind of contagion conjecture. So the idea is that you might start off with a small cluster of true believers. That is people who really don't believe in climate change. But then they might influence people around them to shut up about it. And then those people might influence people around them to shut up about it. And then on and on and on. So it's a crystallization or a contagion process whereby a small group of true believers can sort of modify a culture in order to get them to fall into pluralistic ignorance. I'm going to investigate this using a model of decisions in social settings, where we're going to imagine, we're going to try and construct the situation that I think is most likely to lead to this. So we're going to start off with a model of social interaction called a scale-free network. There is vociferous debate about whether or not these are good models of real social settings. I think that the details of that debate are not going to concern me here. If you're interested to know more, I'm happy to talk about it, but I'm just going to use this as a kind of idealized model. The critical point, the thing that I want to pull out of scale-free networks, it's really important here, is as you can see from the graph that's on the screen, some individuals are very central, lots and lots of people connect to them, and some individuals are not so central. So you can see there's a person in the middle. I don't quite remember in this example how many friends she has, but she has tons. You can see that. And then you look at the people on the outside, lots of them have only one or two or three other friends. So here this represents a setting where you have very unequal social settings. That is where some people are very influential and some people are not. And now we're going to start off this model by we're going to initialize people with random beliefs. Some of them are going to be true believers, some of them will be not true believers, and then they'll start out by making a public declaration. And then they'll survey their neighbors and they'll see what their neighbors said. And if they find themselves uncomfortable, that is, if their utility function says, oh, you shouldn't have said what you said, they're going to switch what they say. And then that process is going to repeat, because maybe if I switch, then that influences you, et cetera. And that's going to continue until the system stabilizes. And then we're going to ask how much pluralistic ignorance ends up in that setting. And here's a graphical representation of a bunch of simulations. So the x-axis represents the average belief of the community. Now, individuals differ, but we can ask what's the average belief of the community. So on the left side of the graph, most people disbelieve the proposition. On the right side of the graph, most people believe it. And in the middle, it's about 50-50. The triangles, the red triangles, represent the proportion of the population that's making an individual declaration. So numbers towards the top of the graph represent everyone saying that they agree. Numbers towards the bottom of the graph represent everyone saying that they disagree. The blue circles represent the proportion of people that are saying the opposite of what they believe. So these are people that have been forced to switch. And then you can barely see it because it's at the bottom. The blue line represents the proportion of simulations which are, properly speaking, pluralistic ignorance. That is where most people, the majority of people, are saying the opposite of what they believe. You see it's down there at the bottom. Basically, pluralistic ignorance never arises. The left-hand plot is for people who are very conformity-driven. That is, they don't care much for the truth. And the right-hand plot is for people who are not very conformity-driven. So there are lots of details here. I won't go into all of them. The big thing that I want to point out is that although there is a lot of conformist behavior, a lot of people are saying things that they don't believe, in this setting, it seems to be about equal numbers are going in both directions. And in particular, we do not, in fact, basically never do we generate a setting of pluralistic ignorance based on this model. Now, this model is with random beliefs chosen just by the computer at random, but we might ask, well, what if the situation is even worse, right? So what if we make the situation bad by disproportionately making the people who are more connected more likely to have one kind of belief or another, right? So if we say the people who are most connected are also the people who are most prone to believe in climate change or disbelieve in climate change, something like that, maybe that will help by sort of concentrating a particular opinion amongst those who are socially more connected. And indeed, that's exactly what happens. So the plot on the left is exactly the plot that you saw before. I'm just copying it then for comparison. The plot on the right is new. The plot on the right is where we are sort of worst case scenario, or in a certain sense, best case scenario for pluralistic ignorance. We assign those people who are most connected to the most extreme belief. All right, so we've constructed a situation where those people who are most connected have the most extreme belief. And now you can see we can generate pluralistic ignorance. In fact, we can almost guarantee it in settings where the average belief is right around 50%. So if most people have the opinion that they're sort of close to indifference, but maybe slightly against the proposition, but those people who are most connected are those that are most likely to be in favor of the proposition, then we can generate pluralistic ignorance. Right? So this is a sort of proof of possibility. The model suggests that pluralistic ignorance can arise via contagion process, but it does require a couple of things. It requires that there be unequal social connection, that is, some people that are massively more connected than others, and it also requires that there be a correlation between that social connectivity and belief. So that is, there are two things that have to be here. The social structure has to be a certain way, and the beliefs have to match the social structure. So contagion is possible. It's definitely a potential cause of pluralistic ignorance, but in a certain sense, it's special. It requires a relatively special set of circumstances. Now I want to move on to the second potential cause of pluralistic ignorance, which is belief change. So it might be the case that what's going on here underneath is that people are changing their minds, but because they're changing their minds privately, it may be that the public declarations sort of lag behind. And this has been postulated as, in particular, the cause of pluralistic ignorance about phenomena where we see relatively rapid private change in beliefs. So for instance, attitudes towards LGBTQ populations is one situation where people think that pluralistic ignorance was prominent, that in, say, for instance, in the 1990s, that private opinions about the acceptability of non-heterosexual sexual orientations was growing, but because of pluralistic ignorance, that wasn't expressed until, say, the end of the 90s, as widely as we saw. So in order to do that, we'll again try and model it. And here we'll start with everybody believing the proposition, say something very high. And then over time, their sort of belief degrades towards zero. We're not modeling any explicit like arrival of evidence process, but you could imagine that that's what's going on. People start out really certain in something, and then evidence arrives, which is making them privately more skeptical. But their public declarations are still governed by that process that I described below. So they start out saying what they believe, and then their beliefs change, but they continue to say what they used to believe because of social influence. This is not many simulations. This is just one simulation to provide an illustration of what's going on. Again, we're looking at a scale-free social network, so with very unequal social influence. And first, I'd like you to just look at the blue line on the chart. So we start out at the beginning of time. Everybody believes the proposition. Everybody says they believe the proposition. Nothing of any interest is happening, right? People believe something and they say they believe it, and everybody says it. So everything's truthful. And that continues until we cross that threshold where people switch from believing to disbelieving when they cross from that 50% threshold. And that happens at that 50 mark on the x-axis. Now we inhabit a world of pluralistic ignorance. So now you can see everyone, for at least a short time, everybody still declares that they believe the proposition, even though they privately disbelieve it. Now, in this setting, I've chosen people's social sensitivity at random. So what happens is, as we move along, eventually somebody who cares very little for conformity will say, "Ah, to hell with it. I don't believe this anymore." And so they say that they don't believe it anymore. Now that opens up space for some of their friends to say that they don't believe it anymore. And so they say they don't believe it. And then now you have a contagion in the opposite direction. Pluralistic ignorance exists, but then collapses via a kind of contagion process. And that's what you see here. Pluralistic ignorance exists for just a little bit, collapses, although it never goes away entirely. You'll notice that blue line doesn't go all the way to the bottom. There's still little pockets of people who they don't believe it, but all of their friends say they believe it. And so the pluralistic ignorance persists in little social pockets here and there. That's the blue line. the green dot dash line is an example where I'm making the most conformist people also be the people that are most central. So that is, the people that are the most central are the people that are most affected by conformity. And you see that makes pluralistic ignorance persist longer. And then the red dashed line is the opposite. That's a case where the people who are most socially central care the least for conformity. If you ask me, I mean, I'm no social psychologist or sociologist, but if I was forced to guess, I would guess it's more like we're at the green line than the red line. But you know, that's just me complaining about people who are well connected socially. So this is just an illustration of a single simulation run, but in fact, this phenomena is robust. I'm not going to walk you through this particular chart because it doesn't actually show you anything more than what I showed you in the illustration last time. This is just for those of you that want to make sure I'm not trying to sneak one over on you by showing you a non-representative example. This is the phenomena that I just showed you is representative when we do many simulation runs and double check for them. So this is a real phenomenon. Okay, so what do we have here? So what this seems to suggest is that in the context of belief change over time, pluralistic ignorance is far more likely to emerge. And so as a result, the simulation models suggest that one of these processes is far more likely to produce pluralistic ignorance than the other. At least that's the conclusion that I tend to draw from these things. But before I sort of sum up with all of this, I do want to address sort of one very last lingering question, an objection that some of you may have in mind, which is in this model, I don't explicitly model the beliefs of each individual agent about the others. So that is, we've got one, most people believe P, most people who believe P say not P. We've got two. Three is a little tricky because it's like, well, in the model, I'm not actually having people infer what are the beliefs of others. And so you might say, oh, you know, this model is a little misleading because I'm not actually fully generating three. And here I'm going to just wave my hands a little bit, which is to say that that's absolutely right. And one of the things that people worry about with pluralistic ignorance is pluralistic ignorance does require that I think that other people are different than me. That is, I know that my behavior and my beliefs are uncorrelated in this setting, but I believe that other people's beliefs and behavior is correlated in this setting. And so as a result, there's a certain, people think that there may be a kind of irrationality to pluralistic ignorance because it requires that I think that I am unusual in a certain respect. I actually don't think that this is correct. So I won't, time's a little short, so I won't walk you through these graphs in any detail. Let me just give you the hand wavy version, and this can just be a pretty picture. In the hand wavy version, it goes like this. Suppose I know nothing about you. So I have no idea what your beliefs are, and I also have no idea what your desire to conform is. You're just a person to me, and I'm totally ignorant about your psychology, both on the belief side and on the desire side. And then I come to see that you say that you don't believe in climate change, and you live in a community of other people who also say they don't believe in climate change. Indeed, I have to acknowledge that it's possible that you really do believe in climate change, but that you're just conforming, that you're not saying your belief truly. That's a possibility, and it's a possibility which I have to acknowledge. But I can eliminate one thing. I can know for sure that you are not a person who believes in climate change and doesn't care what other people think. So, because if you were that, then you would just say you believed in climate change. So as a result, if I do a sort of proper Bayesian updating about what I think about you, if I see you say you don't believe in climate change, that does raise the probability that you genuinely do not believe in climate change. Even though I have to acknowledge that it's possible that you, like me, are being pluralistically ignorant, the proper rational update here is to say, well, but it's now more likely that he doesn't believe in climate change than that he does, something like that. And this is a point that Mosseni and Williams explore a little bit in the way that they're employing the model. So these are reproductions or regenerations of graphs that you can find in their paper. And so the point here is that even though I haven't done so in the model, if we were to make our agents a little bit more sophisticated and have them engage in some kind of social reasoning, they would now sort of fully embody the definition of pluralistic ignorance. That is, they would indeed come to say the opposite of what they believe, and they would do so rationally in a certain sense. And so that's to suggest, I think, a kind of interesting phenomenon, which is that pluralistic ignorance may be a kind of collective irrationality. That is, that rational individuals can experience pluralistic ignorance. And so it may be an example of a kind of collective bad or social epistemological bad that doesn't necessarily project down to an individual bad. Now, there does need to be some ignorance. That is, they can't be, of course, fully aware of everyone else. I mean, if I knew what everyone else's belief was, we wouldn't be in pluralistic ignorance. But it, you're not necessarily irrational for not knowing things. So I think that this is a situation where, in the right circumstances, pluralistic ignorance can be generated even in communities of rational individuals. Now, real human beings are not necessarily fully rational, and so there may be additional things going on that generate pluralistic ignorance, but we don't necessarily need to say that pluralistic ignorance is the result of individual irrationality. Okay, so just to sort of sum up as I'm sort of getting to the end of the clock here, let me just say a few things. The first is that pluralistic ignorance can arise via contagion. That is a phenomena that I think I've illustrated, but it does require relatively special conditions. So it requires that there be unequal social connections. Without them, contagion would be basically impossible. I left out some things I've looked at there to try and illustrate that more concretely, but maybe you can just trust me for the moment that you really do need the unequal social connections and a correlation between somebody's sort of social influence and their beliefs. That if you just have a society where it's sort of random what people believe based on their social influence, pluralistic ignorance is not likely to arise via contagion. On the other hand, in a society that is experiencing slow exogenous belief change because social norms are changing or because evidence is arriving slowly, like in the case of climate change, or because people are doing private research or something like that, that's far more likely to lead to pluralistic ignorance. In a certain sense, it's almost guaranteed to lead to pluralistic ignorance for at least some amount of time, and how long depends on some details. So if we find ourselves in a case of pluralistic ignorance, and you ask me to guess, how did this case of pluralistic ignorance come about? As a result of these models, I would say it probably comes about as a result of exogenous belief change. And I think contagion is relatively unlikely. In all cases, but especially the exogenous belief change, how long that pluralistic ignorance persists is determined in part by these preferences for conformity, that is this desire to conform, but also the relationship between that and social network location. So if you have people that are the people who are most socially influential are also the ones who have the strongest desire to conform, then you would expect pluralistic ignorance to persist for longer and to be substantially worse than in a setting where the opposite was true, where those who are most socially connected are the most willing to go out on a limb and just say what they believe, regardless of the consequences or something like that. So as a result, this relationship is important. And I think that this is an interesting topic of study, which, as far as I know, hasn't been looked at to a great degree, which is what is the relationship between sort of individual personality differences like desire to conform and social location. There has been some research in this area, not specifically about conformity desire, at least not that I'm aware of, but nonetheless, I think this suggests some interesting potential phenomena. All right, thank you very much for your attention and for coming. I really appreciate how many people are here, and I'm eager to hear what you think.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for this awesome talk. Remember that if you have a question for Kevin, I would like to ask you to click on the Q&A button. It's on the top or the bottom of your screen, and input your name in the text box. And then I'll promote you to the panelist status, and you can ask your question directly to Kevin. So Sandy, I will promote you first, and you can ask your question. And I see someone. Go for it, Sandy.
Great. Hi, Kevin. Good to see you. So I had a question about this network structures and how much you were going to explore different kinds of structures, as well as the role of the kinds of norms that govern different structures that are part of a complex structure. So what I'm thinking of is that there could be subsets, and I think we might be seeing this currently in some political discourse, subsets that promote contrarian beliefs to the larger population, right? But conformist beliefs within the subset. So it strikes me that the social structure has a lot to say. It's not just the individuals who personalities. I mean, that seems to me less relevant than the kinds of norms governing different social structures. So in science in particular, contrarian beliefs are often promoted. That's a good thing. That's challenging science, it's severe testing, it's all those things. In other communities, say religious communities, conformist views are more supported, and nonconformity is so there's these other costs that are associated rather than being correct or being incorrect about others' beliefs. So I'm wondering how much of the structure within these networks you are exploring or have explored.
Good. That's a really good set of questions, and I think the first thing that you asked about was like, what about other network structures? I have looked at some others. In particular, I looked at the other extreme, which is just totally flat, where there's no unequal social influence, and it's very hard to get. It's impossible to get contagion. Basically, you can actually even show it. There's a sense in which it's possible. Now, the next point that you make, which I think is really interesting, is to point out a way in which this model is too simple. The model assumes that the conformity desire here is explicitly just a desire to conform, and that one treats sort of all of one's social connections equally. So I just want to conform to my community, and my community is defined by the network structure. But of course, it may well be much more complicated than that. It may be that I want to conform to, if suppose that I'm, like my neighbor in Pittsburgh, a Trump supporter in a very non-Trump supporting neighborhood, right? She may be conforming with, say, her family, who doesn't, who lives outside of Pittsburgh, and I take was probably Trump supporters, and she may also take some joy in anti-conforming, in being different than the physical people that live around her. That may also be driving her. In fact, I think in her case probably is. And so that's a case where her conformity preferences are very complicated and totally impossible to represent in the framework that I just had, because she's sort of choosing these people that I'm connected to, I want to be like them, and these people that I'm connected to, I want to be unlike them. And that's definitely a possibility, and one that the model is simply not capable of generating. I think it would be interesting to look at. I don't immediately have any intuitions that, well, actually, let me rephrase that. My intuition is that I don't think that that would make it easier to get pluralistic ignorance to arise. So in a certain setting, that complexity, while certainly making it more realistic, would not generate any novel mechanisms for the generation of pluralistic ignorance. But I haven't thought about it until just now. So there may be something that I'm missing, or maybe a way in which it generates pluralistic ignorance that I haven't thought of. But it certainly would be interesting to think about. I mean, it may be possible that anti-conformity could drive pluralistic ignorance in a certain sense, where it's like, I guess some people have suggested that this might have been what happened with QAnon, that you had some people that were just saying crazy things to say crazy things, and then they somehow talk themselves into it or something like that. So I don't know, maybe I'm talking myself into thinking that there might be a mechanism in there. It's a good suggestion and one that I haven't looked at. And I think one that in terms of trying to make the model realistic is definitely a direction to go.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sandy.
Thanks indeed. Kevin, Dost, go for it.
Cool. Thanks, Kevin. This was super interesting. I had a lot of small questions. Maybe I'll just ask one of them now and thank you another time. But in the belief change model, am I right to think that all the people have are changing beliefs basically at the same rate? Like we all start out, okay. And so I was thinking that's part of the reason why it's inevitable, because like I've read that everyone crosses over at the same point, and then there's a lag time before sort of everyone changes what they say. So I was just curious what happens if you sort of, I don't know, have different, layer on different mechanisms of belief change. Obviously it could just be random, but also like, it seems like you'd layer on very easily, I don't know how easily, computationally, but conceptually easily, like sort of learning from neighbors sort of phenomenon or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what you would see is, again, it wouldn't be fundamentally different. But it would just be, it would be another way that social network location might make a difference. So if you might imagine, sort of everybody starts, over here with an extreme belief, but rather than what I had, which you correctly described, uniform, everyone simultaneously marches toward a different belief, some people go faster, some people go slower. There's probably, I haven't looked at it, so this is all conjecture, but I feel pretty confident in this intuition because I feel like I understand how the model works. It's simple enough. I feel like I got a grip on it. Now you've got a three-way interaction. You've got the speed of change, the social location, and the desire to conform. And so the thing that would be the worst for pluralistic ignorance is if the people that are most central change their belief the fastest and have the lowest desire to conform, because then those people they'll be the vanguards, right? And that may be what happened with like LGBTQ acceptance, where you had, Hollywood was changing their beliefs faster than was rural Kansas, and Hollywood is also socially more connected. That is, they're and so as a result, that is going to be a case where you would see pluralistic ignorance collapse much faster. And then, the other extreme would be the opposite, where the people that are most socially connected are slowest to change their beliefs and most desirous of conformity. So that my intuition is that's definitely realistic and certainly worth looking at, but that it wouldn't fundamentally change the system, but rather just sort of turn the volume up on the mechanisms that I've already listed. That's my intuition, but it's a good point.
Kevin, you said you had further questions. Do you want to stay around? And if no one shows up, do you want to ask?
Yeah, leave me in the queue. Right.
All right, good, perfect. Perry, go for it.
I think you're still muted.
Perry, go for it.
Okay. I'm unmuted, Edward. Ready to rumble, yeah. Anyway, Kevin, I got two concerns. I'll give you the first one too, the easy one. The research about QAnon being worthless is false, okay? They've had to retract the whole literature, yet hundreds of scientists persisted in using it, the reference, and also politicians persisted in using it. So the research is no good. Okay, that's number one. Okay, there are doctors who are using QAnon, and they claim they're getting good results, but a lot of them are afraid to advertise it very much because everyone else is saying they're still saying it's no good. So, and then of course, I guess former President Trump said it was good, worth trying, and Dr. Fauci said it wasn't. So
You're talking about hydroclinic?
Yeah, hydroquinone. Okay, you were talking about something else. What were you were talking
I
about?
wasn't talking about that.
Okay, that's the first thing. I'll go on to it shows you the persistence and the consequences of people believing something and the and causing serious damage. Okay, or might be causing serious damage. Okay, my other question was the following.
I think we will stop here, and we will give Kevin an opportunity to respond briefly, and then we'll move on to the other question, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Webb. Yeah.
Well, so I mean, I think that the thing that's really tricky, of course, with respect of thinking about scientific disagreements in the context of pluralistic ignorance is there are a couple of different things going on. The first is the point that Sandy just made, which is that it's not always clear in the context of science whether or not there is strong incentive to conform. There is some incentive to conform in certain respects. Obviously, I need to get things past reviewers. I need to get things that are regarded as acceptable from the scientific community as a whole. But also, I need to do things that are novel, right? And there is really incentive to be different. Because if I just publish something that everyone already agrees with, well then, you know, A, I won't get it published, but sure as hell I'm not going to get famous from doing so. People get famous from disagreeing. So the degree to which the model that I'm describing is a model of scientific behavior, I want to suggest not, right? So, insofar as I'm doing a philosophy of science, I think I'm engaging in a philosophical discussion of a scientific concept, that is pluralistic ignorance, but I don't think that there is credible evidence that there is much pluralistic ignorance in the scientific community. At least I've seen very little. It certainly could happen. I don't mean to suggest that it couldn't, but my conjecture is that there is just not very much evidence that pluralistic ignorance is a serious problem in the scientific community. So this is really a phenomena that I think is more a social phenomena that occurs outside of situations where people are actively incentivized to disagree, and less a phenomena that occurs in science. So I would be surprised if there were lots of cases of pluralistic ignorance in science, especially in the context of COVID. But I mean, you know, I could be proven otherwise, but at least for me, the evidential barrier would be high.
Well,
we're going to leave it here for now, since there are other people in the queue. Colin, can you go next?
Yeah. Hey, Kevin. Thanks. Good. So this is really just have you thought about this, and maybe it's already included in the models that you're describing. But a couple of times during the talk, one of the assumptions under which you get the pluralistic ignorance is that the belief in question is the function of the network position, and a couple of times you said things which sort of hinted at a causal relationship. But I was also thinking that the causal relationship in many sorts of networks, you and I spend enough time on Twitter to be aware of this, might be that your social position in the network is actually a function of your willingness to have these kinds of extreme beliefs. So I've wondered if you've thought about how that kind of relationship factors in, and it might even apply in the drinking case, right? So nobody wants to be the first person to leave the party because you're giving up a certain kind of social structure or social capital there, right?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it is something I've thought about a little bit, because one thing that I've left out of my model, and I've actually done so intentionally, is that social learning phenomenon. That is, the declarations of the other people around me don't change my belief in the model, right? The idea is my belief is my belief. In the first model, it's just my belief and it never changes. And in the second model, it changes based on this outside pressure, but there's no internal pressure. And I did that very consciously, not because I believe that that's the way the world works. Quite the contrary. In fact, I think that our beliefs are influenced by others' beliefs to a great degree, both in the rational sense, we learn from one another, but also in a kind of irrational sense. But the problem from the perspective of my narrow question, that is pluralistic ignorance, is if that happens, it actually makes pluralistic ignorance even more difficult. Because take the drinking example, and let's make it a little bit more epistemic. Maybe I think, I've drank too much, this will be harmful to my health, right? So rather than just a raw preference, let's make it kind of epistemic, right? And then I look, and so the classic pluralistic ignorance setting would be, I privately think I've drank too much, it'll be bad for my health, but everyone else seems to be okay with this. If I come to learn from other people, then I'll change my belief. And so we will go from what looks like a case of pluralistic ignorance to just an outright case of, we all believe that it's perfectly healthy to binge drink or whatever. And so when you add in that added wrinkle, this is something which I took out of the talk, but I talk about a little bit in the draft of the chapter that I have. When you add in that added wrinkle, it actually makes pluralistic ignorance even more difficult to bring about. Because now I start to change my belief as a result of my social network location. And exactly what you see on Twitter, right? If I'm surrounded by other conservative voices, I come to believe even more conservative views, you might imagine. Or if I'm surrounded by more liberal voices, I come to hold even more liberal views. And so as a result, what maybe even starts out as pluralistic ignorance just becomes outright, groupthink or something like that. And so you're absolutely right. As like a model of social phenomena, I've left out a really critical part. I've done so in order to try and sort of isolate pluralistic ignorance from these other phenomena. And this is part because I think that these, in the literature, especially the social psychology literature, people aren't always careful about distinguishing between which of these things is happening. And so, but I think that as a conceptual matter, and even as a kind of pragmatic matter, we want to know which one's going on because the interventions will be different in the different cases. So.
Thanks, Colleen. Greg.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. And during your talk, I was struck a couple of times by the possibility of an old classic tale that might fit into this, and that is the Chinese emperor's new suit, where he tells everyone that he is going to come out with this brand new suit, and we all know how he shows up, and we hear what everyone says, except of course for that little kid. And I don't know, that might have some relevance, but might be several paragraphs for your book. But I was, especially with regard to that social networking thing, where that emperor is well connected. And by that, I mean, he has at least presumably has a direct connection to everyone who is going to be telling him what he wants to hear, and has the authority and whatever the degree of belief, P099, whatever, they don't really care. They're just going to say what they're going to say, even though they know what they believe. And I would just I mean, that's an interesting side example. It's a fictitious example, but when one gets to the realm of sort of authoritarian regimes, or they're told what they're supposed to be saying, I wonder if this fits into your model.
Absolutely, and the Emperor's New Clothes is a classic example that's used to illustrate pluralistic ignorance quite often. I actually think it's somewhat ambiguous. So part of the reason that I don't like to use it as a motivating example is the story, it's actually somewhat ambiguous between, so well, actually, let me say this a little bit differently. There's several things going on there, some of which are pluralistic ignorance and some are not. There's a question of, does the emperor in fact have clothes or not, right? And so that might be something about which maybe there's pluralistic ignorance, but maybe not. It may be that each individual genuinely does believe that the emperor is wearing this incredibly fine gown and that they themselves are Philistines. And so they can't see those incredibly fine gowns. And so they will pretend to see it, not because of an immediate case of pluralistic ignorance, but rather this indirect or somewhat related case of pluralistic ignorance where I want to hide the fact that I'm a Philistine. And so I will pretend to fit in. Anyway, it's definitely a really interesting illustration, but I think already even the interesting illustration shows how complicated these phenomena are. And the same thing holds true about authoritarian regimes. So I've forgotten the author's name now, but there is a pretty famous book that suggests that pluralistic ignorance was at the core of the lack of protest against or resistance to the USSR in the 1970s and 80s, I think. That was, most people didn't support the regime, but thought that other people did, or didn't support the party and thought that other people did. And so as a result, they failed to revolt. I've heard, I'm certainly no expert on the history of, on sociological history of the USSR, but I've heard people say that they think that that's not really correct, and that that's more of a case like the story about my friend's obnoxious husband, which is everybody knew that everybody hated the regime, but everyone knew that they couldn't stop it, and that if they said anything, they'd just go to jail and it wouldn't do any good, so they didn't. And so that, again, I sort of go into this because not to be critical. In fact, these are great examples, and talking about them is super interesting. I just wanted to kind of pick into them a little bit to illustrate this is what is so incredibly both philosophically interesting, but also philosophically difficult about this scientific concept of pluralistic ignorance, is that these different concepts are so closely related and sociologically similar that it's very difficult to really prove that you have a case of pluralistic ignorance and not a case of a related phenomena. But it's not a matter of just philosophically dicing things up and being obnoxiously pedantic, because it really does matter what kind of interventions. So the case of the Emperor's New Clothes, all it took to end the pluralistic ignorance was a single declaration. The child says the emperor is naked, and then all of a sudden everyone's willing to admit they're naked. And in fact, there's some real life examples of this sort of thing. But if it's the case like that some people conjecture Russia was in, where it's not pluralistic ignorance, a single declaration won't do any good. It won't cause this collapse of pluralistic ignorance. And so it's really interesting that like these things are very difficult to tease apart, but in terms of their causal effects, they have very different causal effects in terms of the sociological consequences.
Thank you very much. I was also very much aware that there were and are different interpretations of the original story. So.
Yeah.
Thanks, Greg. Kevin, do you want to have a shot, second shot?
I think that probably, well, yeah, sure. But I think that maybe is answers my question. But I was wondering about like a version which took like the pluralistic part of pluralistic ignorance seriously. That it's like, okay, majority is not what's crucial here. What's crucial is like that you think enough people think this. And I was wondering, I mean, first I was having a little bit trouble interpreting the first models, but I was wondering if the one that looked like that. But I was curious whether something like sort of, you know, a good number of people say what they don't believe, and whether on some ways of setting up the incentives waiver that looks something like pluralistic ignorance. That's why I was thinking what you just said makes me think, well, maybe that's actually not a relevant concept.
No, that's a really good question. So, and this connects a little bit with Sandy's question too, which is in this model, the only way to kind of get something like pluralistic ignorance requires, at least in my local social network, that a majority of people say the opposite of what I believe. Because if a majority say what I believe, then I'm going to say what I believe. But that's not like I wouldn't take that to be an empirical assumption. It's just built into the model. It wouldn't be hard to build into the model. It would be quite easy to build into the model something like, well, there's a bias in one direction or the other. Like all it takes is 10% of the people doubting climate change, and then I don't want to say anything about climate change or something like that. More complicated and probably more realistic would be this setting of like, maybe there are important people and I care really what they think, right? So, you know, like it's not so much about a majority minority issue in my social network, but rather something like some kind of weighted thing where it's like, look, it's far more difficult for me to contradict the opinion of, you know, say my boss than it is for me to contradict the opinion of an underling or something like that. And so it may be that that you could get pluralistic ignorance in cases where, you know, I don't care what most people think, but I care what these people think. And if I think these people like drinking, then I want to go out drinking or something like that. And I don't know it well enough, but I've heard that this might be an explanation for like certain types of drinking behavior in corporate Japan, where there's a lot of drinking and there's a lot of dislike for that drinking. But my understanding is that it's not that most of the employees think that most of the employees want to do it, but most of the employees think the bosses want to do it. And that's what matters, right? And so I think that this may be, this certainly could be a real thing. and would be an important variation of the model. Now, what kind of difference would it make? I think it's interesting then, because now you got to wonder about like, what is it, how do those weights relate to connections in the social networks? How do they, but yeah, I think it's certainly possible and very plausible that there might be settings of pluralistic ignorance that are driven largely by people caring about, what does that person say? What does my boss say? Or what does the journalist say? Or what is the person whose opinion matters most to me? Or what?
The thing that one quick thought that I felt like that might interact interestingly with the point about central nodes being slower to change beliefs. And so like if you think Twitter is like sort of, there's like the blue check people who like, they're the in group, and then like there's the rest of us folks. Then like if the blue check people are highly incentivized not to like say something wrong because they might get canceled, and if what they care about also is like what the other blue check people actually say, then there might be some interaction effects there.
Absolutely, yeah, and so I think that's right. So, and it would make things even more attenuated if it's the people I care about are also the people who are more socially connected, which in a world like Twitter, and even a regular world, it makes sense, right? Like if you only have one, if I am your only friend, if you decide that I'm wrong about something, there's so very little that you can do to me. But if, Edouard can badmouth me to the whole entirety of the field, maybe then I care more about conforming with Edouard than I care about conforming with you or something. Sorry, I didn't mean that to be like an actual people example.
Cool. Thank you very much. Anna, go for it.
Hi, Kevin. So I wanted to ask a question about the thing that you said sort of at the beginning of the talk, where you made a distinction between preference-based and epistemic pluralistic ignorance. It made sense, the distinction made sense, and I thought it makes sense for the kinds of things you're talking about. But then as you kept describing the models, and even in the Q&A, a lot of your examples have been things that are preference-based. So I'm wondering, is there a reason that maybe I'm missing in your model why we can't just interpret the P, whatever it is, as strength of preference, where 0.5 is your indifferent, and you can talk about people changing their preferences over time and whether or not pluralistic ignorance will persist? So is there a reason why this has to be focused on the epistemic cases and not the preference-based cases?
So I think you're absolutely right. I think you could reinterpret the parts of the model, and the core part of what I was talking about was entirely consistent with a preference-based, where that P represents something like a strength of preference, or the difference between the desire to drink and not drink, or something like that. And I think that would be fine. And preference change is certainly a very plausible thing. I mean, now life gets a little complicated because we have to try and explain how preferences are changing over time, although that's okay. The reason that I wanted to highlight the epistemic case was actually because that's the case where I think that distinguishing between things like social learning and pluralistic ignorance becomes most important. That is, preferences, I mean, I guess, of course, preferences might be influenced by other people's preferences, and that might be like social learning in a certain setting. But nonetheless, it's sort of tricky to talk about social learning in the context of preferences, whereas in the context of epistemology, it is quite relevant. I do learn things. So that part of the reason why I wanted to focus on that case was not so much because I thought the models had to be about it, but because I do think that like some of these distinctions that I was making, some of these categories are empty in the preference-based case, whereas in the epistemic case, they're real, or there's a real thing there. And then the other thing that's a little tricky, and this was the stuff right at the end where I was sort of stealing that stuff from the Mohseni-Williams model, is that those cases, now the thing that I'm learning is trickier, because instead of thinking about I have a belief and I'm trying to decide whether most people believe this or not, now I'm trying to learn preferences of most people, and it's a little harder to say what's the thing that we're pluralistically ignorant about. So that's the case where, and this maybe now that I'm saying it out loud, maybe this is just much more about a like expediency of presentation than a real deep philosophical difference. But in the cases of like binge drinking, which I call the preference case, to say what are we pluralistic ignorant about is a little tricky, because it's, well, we're pluralistic ignorant about something like what do most people want to do, or something like that. Like that's the proposition that there's pluralistic ignorance about. And so then it's like, well, but then the relationship between the belief, I don't want to drink, and the thing that we're pluralistic ignorant about, most people don't want to drink, is complicated. Whereas in the epistemic case, it's actually quite simple. I believe in climate change, and we're pluralistic ignorant about climate change. So that proposition is the same in both cases. So that's also, whether that's like a really a deep difference, or maybe just lets me write shorter sentences difference, I don't know. But part of the reason that I wanted to focus on that is just because it's very easy to say, you know, it's the proposition P that we're pluralistic ignorant about. That's what our beliefs are, and that's what our declarations are, and they're all the same proposition. Whereas in the preference case, they're actually like three different things, and so there's just more stuff to keep track of. And it's not a terribly helpful answer to your question, but that's sort of what I.
All right, thank you very much, Anna. Thank you, Kevin. I think we're going to be ending here today. Thank you very much to all the attendees, and I hope to see all of you on Friday, and have a good end of the week. Bye, guys. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, bye.